Roughly midway between the first and second Democratic presidential primary debates, there's a whole lot of polls showing a whole lot of, well, depends on who you ask and which polls you want to talk about. This time on Poll Hub, dissecting the post and pre-debate polls. Plus, what the latest polls say about that other guy. What's his name? Donald Trump. Oh yeah, the president. Has anything really changed since the very first set of polls we did back in the winter of 2017 on President Donald Trump? Lots to talk about, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Mary Griffith, Director of Media Initiatives and Polling News here at the Marist Poll, also Executive Producer of Poll Hub. Hey, everyone. So we are about 2 weeks away from the first Democratic primary debates, and there have been a slew of polls. So, Lee, what are we seeing in terms of those post-debate polls, and should we really be putting a lot of credence in them?
Well, let me take the second question first. I mean, I think it's reasonable to look at them and see any kind of movement. One thing we know about elections, there's going to be a lot of movement all among the Democratic contenders from here until the caucus and primaries, and then people will be dropping in, coming out. So, this is not precision polling, and I think we should look at it like that. And I think that was the case. I mean, I think we saw in a Washington Post ABC poll the fact that there was not a lot of movement in the direction of the frontrunner Biden to anybody else. But in the CNN poll and in the Quinnipiac poll, we did see post-debate movement. And what it all boiled down to is, I think the frontrunner Joe Biden was in front. He continues to be in front. But I think his performance suggests that his lead is tenuous and probably it's going to bring him a lot of unwanted attention in the next round of debates, which will be at the end of July. So that was some of the stuff. I mean, we can dig down a little bit more, but I thought that certainly Biden was not the winner in the debate, and most people felt that Kamala Harris emerged at least from the second debate, and perhaps Elizabeth Warren did well in the first debate. So we end up with a frontier top tier of Joe Biden, and then sort of a Harris, Warren, Sanders middle group, all in the teens, and Beto O'Rourke and Mayor Pete Buttigieg not really emerging, although Buttigieg sure is fundraising a lot despite his poll numbers. So I don't know. What was your take on it?
I think it's important to note a couple things about this stage of a race. Not so much about the polls, but this stage of a race. And at this stage of a race, not a whole lot of voters watched the debates. This was a very widely watched debate, as was the first Republican one back in 2016 or 2015, with Donald Trump. They were very widely watched as debates go, and yet they would have placed like 30 or 40th of the top-rated shows of the week on television. So on one hand, there's a huge amount of interest and attention, but it is among a very small or relatively small group of politically charged people. Same thing kind of goes with the polls, is that the polls, whatever is happening in these polls, you're talking to an electorate that's not terribly engaged. So I think we're catching a lot of noise, but the polls are directional signals to the inside politics gang. So they're directional signals to funders. They're directional signals to people in politics who want to get behind and support other candidates. And so that's where it's interesting to me, is that you see a debate and you see some action in a debate. First debate, there's going to be a bunch of them, and you see some movement around the edges on some numbers. You generally, in these debates, are going to have somebody who breaks out. It may not be a breakout like from last to first, but somebody who's going to break out. And Kamala Harris, clearly in the chattering classes, in the political classes, she's the one who broke out. And whether that's reflected in polls or not, I'm not sure makes a big difference. Yeah. What does make a difference in terms of the polls is that that after this first debate, you clearly, as you noted, Lee, you've got about 6 or 8 what I would consider to be at least possible candidates to keep going, and a whole bunch of other people who, like Swalwell, who has just done, should probably just say, hey, I made it through the first debate. See you later. I'm going to do something else.
Yeah, if they're waiting for magic to strike, it better strike awfully soon. Yeah, the results on the CNN poll did have the number one standing out in the debates was Kamala Harris at 41%. Nobody else got into the 30s. The next best was Elizabeth Warren at 26. So in terms of just who did what, I think it's fair to say that that was the breakout for the two of them, and it's reflected in all the coverage they've gotten since, and all the fundraising. I think just from a polling standpoint, word of caution, when you start with a national poll and then you start boiling it down and you get not even to likely voters, but you just get to Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents, you're talking about margins of error of 5 or 6 points, depending on the sample size. And so that suggests that although the polls had some different winners and different losers in terms of the spread, if you average them out, our friend Harry Enton at CNN took an average of the different 3 or 4 quality polls that were put together and had Biden at 25, Harris at 17, Sanders at 15, Warren at 14. So kind of like Biden in front, but with that tenuous lead, and then the others. And I think that's a realistic way of looking at it. And I would say one other thing just about the polls, because you did talk about in the introduction how we're going to be talking about President Trump, because this is where this is all leading, And for the Democrats, these national polls don't suggest what's going to be happening in each of the states, which ultimately become critical when we get closer to the Iowa caucus, to the New Hampshire primary, because you got to sort of win some of those or do decently to keep the campaign, if there's 10, 8, whatever it is, candidacy still viable at that point. These national polls obscure,
we're a long way from that.
And Lee, I'm glad you mentioned those state polls, because I believe it was Suffolk University and USA Today. They recently released a survey of Iowa. And what's interesting is that Biden is still up over Harris, or is up over Harris by, I think it's about 8 points. But when you combine the first and second choice candidates, really it's a competitive contest.
And you have to do that because in the caucuses in Iowa, it's not a vote. It's a bunch of people in a room who are choosing their first choice candidate. But then as people do not reach a threshold, as candidates 4, 5, and 6 don't reach a threshold, those people's candidates, supporters, join in frontrunners. So first and second choice combined is a really important metric to ask in Iowa.
And so should we be focusing then on those types of procedural discussions rather than focusing on the horse race at this point in the primary contest?
Well, the horse race, I think, is of most interest because, as Jay pointed out, it does cue the fundraisers a little bit. And some of, if there are in this big field different lanes that are being contested, so maybe Joe Biden is sort of the moderate conservative and he's maybe out by himself a little bit, but Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, well, they're fighting for a similar constituency. And when they get to New Hampshire, they're both neighbors to New Hampshire from Massachusetts and Vermont, of course. And they're sort of, if Warren starts getting momentum and Bernie Sanders doesn't, that may mean big problems for Bernie. And I think the same was true for Kamala Harris and New Jersey Senator Booker, because she seems to be doing better there, and and then you get maybe one other lane, which is Buttigieg and Beto O'Rourke, and Buttigieg seems, at least in the fundraising and the chattering class, to be doing better than Beto O'Rourke. So some of these contests are good for the cues that they provide. And that may be most significant. But again, that Iowa poll you cite, and then New Hampshire polls that will be coming out, those will be seen as critical polls, even if these are also seen as critical polls, at least in the short runs. Everything's critical.
So we're talking about the Democrats, but both you and Jay brought up President Donald Trump, and there is a new survey out by the Washington Post and ABC News, which shows President Trump's job approval rating at its highest point since taking office. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, first of all, the highest was relative to the same kind of 42 to 45 he's been in. And it suggests that, his support, again, fairly consistent. I think it was highest by 1 point, which I don't think people should get too excited about. But the 44% approval rating is still matched up against the 53% disapproval, which he has been in the majority disapproval for 2.5 years. And I think that is probably, somewhat telling for where we're going on this. And I'm going to contradict myself in a few minutes when I say that although his disapproval is high, this is likely to be a close race. And I think rather than some of the issues, it may just be his driving personality, his style, his approach that is keeping his base motivated, and also the economy.
Well, but okay, so here's a counter to that. Switch out Donald Trump for literally any other president in United States history and add in the economy, the way it's going, where we're at in terms of foreign affairs, and the general well-being of people, and would that other president, any other president in U.S. history, have been underwater on approval rating for his entire term, let alone right now with a 5 or 6% unemployment rate?
Yeah, I think the fact that it's upside down is, speaks to the fact that in that same poll, which I believe the Washington Post and ABC did, 65% of the country, the same folks who are giving him a 44% approval rate, find him unpresidential, and only 25% find him to be fitting and proper. So I think in terms of his conduct, so I think that is what is keeping him in this number, which suggests that, like Barack Obama before him, the presidency seems to me somewhat impervious to changes in the news, because you sort of lock in, and that's sort of Obama was a little higher, and
right. It's the tribes. It's the whole notion that we're all in tribes, and I mean, you certainly see this with Donald Trump, and I think people would argue you saw that to a large degree with Barack Obama as well. But supporters of his simply don't lose support for him or change their view of him based on any external factors. And in his case, I think there have been more extreme external factors than Barack Obama. But there is nothing that moves the needle. And that kind of gets back to the intro of the show here on this question, which is when we surveyed and when other quality polls surveyed in February and March of 2017, the first 2 months or the first month of President Trump's administration, his approval and disapproval ratings were essentially where they are now on the average of these quality polls. It's gone up a little, it's gone down a little, but as you alluded to, he's been in a range. He hasn't gotten out of that range. And the number that I always look to, and the number that I think is the most telling, is the number of people who say when they're asked, and not every poll asks it, would you definitely vote for or definitely vote against Donald Trump if the election were held today? And the definitely against is over 50% in every one of those polls. I don't know how you win if everybody who's, who goes to the polls says they're going to go to the polls goes to the polls. I mean, that's the way you win in a case like that, is you've got to make sure that nobody on the side that doesn't like you goes to the polls, or fewer of them do.
Yeah, and here I'm going to contradict myself for a second. So in that poll,
we always like it when you do that.
Yeah, well, you go down one road, you go down another road, and then you let the audience decide. But in that same poll, they looked at the leading Democrats, and they matched President Trump up against him. And for most part, the Democrats are, among registered voters, at least ahead or tied with Donald Trump at this point. So I think that speaks again to the notion that all things being equal, he should be in front, but he isn't. But then the contradiction comes in where yet it's still very close, despite the personality and the style and the approach that he has taken. And then one other thing I'll throw into here, Gallup looked at other presidents and how they were doing at this point in their administration. And I was surprised by this, because I thought that Donald Trump's number, even in the low 40s, was going to be lower than others. But Ronald Reagan was at 43, and Barack Obama was also at 43. Jimmy Carter was much worse. It's been a long time since an incumbent president has been dislodged. You have to go back to 1992. And Bill Clinton, and Clinton didn't get a majority, of course.
And at this time, in this time in Bush's term, he had a very high approval rating coming off the war. So that's the flip side, right? There's no way he could have lost based on his approval rating, but he did. And there's no way that that Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama could have won, and yet they did.
Yeah, and right now Donald Trump is getting about what Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan had when they were on the way to a re-election. So on the one hand, we talk about the numbers suggesting some trouble on the edges, but on the other hand, there still seems to be that opportunity for him. I want to ask you guys a question, though, because I've been toying with this. I was just reading an article by Charlie Cook, he was asking whether this is, of the Cook Political Report, whether this is, this increase in Trump's standing, whether it's a trend that we should be watching or it's just a little noise in the short term. But what about the whole notion of his handling of the economy? And you alluded to this, Jay. 51% in this poll approve of his handling of the economy, 42% disapprove. So on the one hand, that should get his approval rating higher. On the other hand, doesn't that position him well for re-election on the notion that, Americans vote their pocketbook and it's the economy stupid and all that? If he's getting 51 on the economy, isn't that a good number for him?
It's a great number for him, and he still has a 44% disapproval rating or approval rating in that poll. I mean, that's what I was saying. Anybody else with this economy and these kind of numbers on the economy, any other president, especially a sitting president, would, it's shoo-in. And these are the kind of conditions in which, again, like Bill Clinton in 1991 walked into as, well, I might as well give it a try. None of the main big candidates are running because they can't possibly beat Bush. And, well, look what happened. So, history is a great guide in a lot of ways for a lot of things. And it's a really good guide. And it's a really good guide for politics most of the time. But you know what gets our attention? The things that break out of that mold. And Donald Trump broke that mold in 2016. So I don't think there's any reason we should expect that 2020 won't be a mold breaker as well.
How serious is it for the Democrats, do you guys think, that there are so many at this point? And does that really matter? Because that's what they're going to start saying, and even some of the comments about Kamala Harris last time was, don't start attacking the folks in our own party who may end up the nominee. Is the fact that there's a crowd, does that give either of you concern for the Democratic side of it, or is this just going to work its way out?
Well, I think certainly there's going to be the natural whittling down of the field, and we're already seeing that start to happen. But I think as we get closer to the second round of debates toward the end of the month, what we're going to see is, again, the Democratic candidates jockeying for position on that stage, trying to make their voice the loudest heard. So at this point, it's just a matter of time and to see who really does take up most of the oxygen on that stage.
Do you feel, Mary, that Biden really has to sort of get it back, get the momentum back? Are people going to be looking at him? I know it's so much earlier than that famous Reagan-Mondale debate where Reagan had to come out on the second one and reprove himself. Do you think Biden is at that? Are people really going to be looking at him?
I think certainly people are going to be looking at Biden. He has a lot to prove. Not that he has a lot to prove, but he has a bit of a comeback. I think a lot of people are disappointed in his first debate performance. And Kamala Harris was very strong. That was what everyone was talking about the next morning, the exchange between Biden and Harris. And so if I were another one of the candidates on that stage, really want to try and find that breakout moment that Jay spoke to earlier.
Yeah, I'm just wondering also whether, the problem with Joe Biden is the curse of him is that he doesn't run well on his own as a candidate. This is, I think, the third time around the track for him. And I think that got his handlers and maybe some of, as Jay alludes to, the chattering class really got their attention. Is this what we're going to get more of? Was he thought of as being the Democratic candidate who would be the least risky against Donald Trump, and now maybe more risky than people thought?
So I think but it's July, and it's a long way to Iowa. Iowa's not until February this year, the caucuses, and we're going to have a lot of conversations and a lot of discussions about a lot of candidates between now and then.
So you don't want me to get too far ahead of my skis on this one.
No, stay in your skis. Water or snow, stay in. You'll need the snow. When going to Iowa and New Hampshire, you're going to need your snow skis.
Just stay dry.
That's the bottom line.
All right, so that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
And you're the executive producer.
Aren't
you supposed to say Mary Griffith? How do you do that when you're saying your own name? That's kind of weird.
That's a little self-serving, don't you think?
It is. Well, Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
And Casey Schaff is our editor.
Now, hold on a second. Is this her first or second time in the rodeo, or?
Who, Mary or Casey?
No, Casey. Mary's
sure sounds like it's my first time.
Mary's up in the hundreds.
It will be Casey's first official editing gig, yes.
Excellent. So welcome, Casey, when you do get to this part. We'd also like to thank, at this point, the Roper Center Archives at Cornell, who provide us with the ability to look back in time and survey questions, stuff we're talking about even today when we're looking at the presidential approval ratings going back in time. It helps understand where we are today.
And we love to hear from you, so get in touch. We are on social media at Marist Poll on Twitter or we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. This is where we take your questions. If you have questions for future polls, it's a great way to get in touch with us because sometimes we'll get suggestions and we'll throw them into a future poll. Or if you have questions for any of us here on Poll Hub, that's the place to get through. And as we always say, don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time.